More than 50 Democrats skipped Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's address to a joint meeting of Congress. After the speech, a group of Democrats held a news conference to respond to the Prime Minister. One of them called his remarks, quote, political theater worthy of an Oscar. This is 45 minutes.
Y'all know what that's about.
You don't pay attention to him anyway. I will go. I think I'll go ahead. Well, thank you all for being here. My name is John Yarmouth of Kentucky. Gathered with me are colleagues, all of whom opposed the appearance of Prime Minister Netanyahu today. Some who attended the event, some who didn't, but all of whom have something to say about his appearance. First of all, again, these remarks are only attributable to me. Everyone can speak for him or herself. First, I'd like to congratulate Speaker Boehner and Prime Minister Netanyahu on a very impressive bit of political theater. Now the Prime Minister can go home to his campaign and say he lectured Congress and the American people on things that apparently we didn't know. I think the speech validated all of the reasons I said I was opposed to the speech. I expected the Prime Minister to speculate on and mischaracterize the negotiations and a potential deal. For instance, he continually said that the deal ends in a certain period of time and there are no restrictions, would be no restrictions on Iran's nuclear program after the deal expired. That is not the case, as we have been advised by the White House. But again, this is part of the strategy that he used. I resented the condescending tone that he used, which basically indicated that he didn't think anybody in Congress or the country understood the threat that a nuclear weaponized Iran poses to his country, to the region, and to the world. I think the President has made it very clear we understand that threat. I don't think that there is any doubt that everyone in Congress and the administration understands that Iran has been a bad actor in the region, that it has sponsored terrorism, that it has done things that we would like to see changed. We all know that. It's nice of him to remind us. And I also resent the fact that he was telling us how to negotiate when the administration and their representatives have been at this for 2 years now, with the cooperation and participation of 5 other major nations in the world. This speech was straight out of the Dick Cheney playbook. This was fear-mongering at its ultimate. Phrases like essentially saying nuclear war is inevitable if this deal were to be accepted. Phrases like this would pave the way to Iran having a nuclear bomb. These are things that I think are, again, part of what Dick Cheney would have done and did. This has been Prime Minister's pattern. He's gone to the UN and done the same thing. I understand, and as all of us do, all of us who desperately support Israel and care very deeply about Israeli security, that Israel perceives its threat differently than we might. But I don't think there is any question that the administration and all of us understand that threat and are trying our best to thwart it. My final comment, Prime Minister Netanyahu basically said that the only acceptable deal was a perfect deal or an ideal deal. It's like the child who says, I want to go to Disneyland every day, eat ice cream and drink Coca-Cola every day and not go to school. That would be a nice life for a child. But this is very serious business, and it is being conducted in a very, very real world. Idealism is fine, as William F. Buckley once said, but as it approaches reality, the costs become prohibitive. And in this case, I believe that insisting on the ideal deal, again, in a world where things constantly change and realities change, is something that for which the cost would be prohibitive. And those costs would be a lost opportunity to put an end to Iran's nuclear program. And with that, I would like to introduce David Price of North Carolina.
Thank you, John, and good morning. As John said, the members here individually made our decisions about attending the speech, but what we're united in is our determination to learn from this controversy, the controversy that surrounded the speech, and to move on to reinforce the U.S.-Israel, a security relationship, and to protect the world against a nuclear-armed Iran. Speaker Boehner should never have extended this invitation at this time, given the proximity of this speech to Israel's national elections and the fact that delicate international negotiations, which the Prime Minister clearly wishes to upend, are hanging in the balance at this moment. And Prime Minister Netanyahu should not have accepted this invitation, which was extended without the usual consultation of bipartisan leadership and the normal notification of and consultation with the President. For these reasons, the invitation and the speech set a dangerous precedent whereby congressional leaders from one party can invite a foreign politician to publicly oppose the policies of the sitting president on the House floor. In doing so, we not only tarnish the grand tradition of the joint session, we also run the risk of politicizing diplomatic relationships, in this case, a very special relationship dedicated to Israel's security and prosperity. But the speech has happened. Now we have to determine the best way forward. We must give due consideration to what the Prime Minister has said, which of course isn't dependent on the form in which he said it. We must also subject his charges and claims to intense scrutiny. For example, the notion that everything has to be solved in terms of our bilateral issues before anything can be solved. For example, the description of the deal which makes an agreement seemingly totally out of reach. We must redouble our efforts to protect Israel, the region, and the world from a nuclear-armed Iran. These are tough negotiations. Of course they're tough. But there are no good alternatives to bringing a comprehensive, strong, and enforceable agreement to fruition. It is extremely important for us and for the international community to stay on that course. Through all of this, our commitment to a safe and secure Israel must remain firm. An open dialogue is critical to that process. I and all of us, I think, stand ready to engage with Israeli leaders from across the political spectrum. This speech today wasn't about whether we agreed or disagreed. It was about the circumstances of this invitation and the lasting damage it could do. But it's our job now to get past this controversy, to focus on the task at hand, securing the relationship with Israel and securing an enforceable international agreement that will prevent a nuclear-armed Iran.
Thanks, David. Next, I'd like to introduce one of the icons of Congress, John Lewis of Georgia.
Thank you very much. In this Congress, I take a back seat to no one in my commitment and support of Israel and the American Jewish community. On many occasions, we have worked side by side to strengthen our democracy and fight for equality and justice in this country. That commitment will not change. I worked consistently throughout my career for long-term peace in the Middle East, a secure Jewish state, and have fought against anti-Semitism and hate on American shores and abroad. However, this nation is currently involved in sensitive, ongoing negotiation with Iran. Election in Israel just about 2 weeks away on March 17th. The Speaker of the House of Representatives would allow the floor of this chamber to be used to undercut the negotiation of the President of the United States is partisan, and it's not right. Several ambassadors, as well as the leader of prominent Jewish organization, call upon the Prime Minister to cancel his speech. The Speaker's action is an affront to the President of the United States, to the Democratic leadership of Congress, and the Department of State. It is meant to purposely undermine the work of our elected and appointed representatives, who are the ones responsible to protect the interests of the American people. The floor of the House is a centerpiece of public debate in our democracy. It should not be used as a partisan tool. And I'm saddened that the Speaker would threaten this historic position bipartisan support of our Israeli brothers and sisters by this action. It is for this reason that I chose not to attend this morning's address, and it is my hope that today's partisan political low will never ever be repeated again on the House floor. Thank you.
Next is Jan Schakowsky of Illinois.
Thank you very much. I agree very much with the goal that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. The president could not be clearer, and that has been the point of the negotiations with 5 other major powers in order to make sure that happens. I agree with the Prime Minister that the United States is Israel's best friend. Sometimes, as often before the United Nations, Israel's only friend. And I agree with the Prime Minister when he said, we have to learn the lessons of history and not repeat the mistakes of the past. And so I want to recount for you some of the words of the Prime Minister when he was a public citizen, not an elected official in Israel, in 2002, when he made a major address. Actually, it was testimony before Dan Burton's committee. And he said, if you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. And he went on to say, quote, and I think that people sitting right next door in Iran, young people and many others, will say the time of such regimes, of such despots is gone. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. In fact, the big winner of the Iraq War was Iran. And then in just last year, the Prime Minister said, on the bottom, where? Yeah, no. Anyway, the Prime Minister said last year that the joint plan of action, here it is, that we've had for the last year, he said that it has not, this is about the JPOA that we enacted last year, it's not made the world a safer place. Like the agreement with North Korea in 2005, this agreement has made the world a much more dangerous place. In fact, the Joint Plan of Action has made the world safer by freezing the Iran's nuclear weapons plans and has been abided by Iran. And so it seems to me that where we're faced right now is this speech that, as Congressman Yarmouth pointed out, had many falsehoods about it. But one is that the intelligence and security agencies of this country and our allies do not support the idea that Iran can somehow unlearn to build centrifuges and have a nuclear infrastructure, and that the kind of proposals that the Prime Minister were suggesting are absolutely impossible. Even destroying the current infrastructure of Iran and its centrifuges and its nuclear capacity would not do the job. The only thing that will do the job is the kind of negotiated, carefully negotiated agreement that has vigorous oversight, intrusive inspections and monitoring. That is where we are going. We should be able to continue to lock down and roll back in a very verifiable way the Iran's ability to achieve a nuclear weapon. That's the goal. We can't achieve it Bibi Netanyahu's way.
Thank you, Jan. Next up is G.K. Butterfield of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. Good afternoon to all of you. I am Congressman G.K. Butterfield. I represent the 1st District of North Carolina, Chief Deputy Whip of the House Democratic Caucus, and now the Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. But today I speak in my individual capacity as one of 435 members of the House. You know, my first reaction was to come to this press conference this afternoon and simply remain solid and just keep my personal opinions personal. But that is contrary to my personality, and so I will simply just lay out some facts that supported my conclusion. I was a judge for 15 years in North Carolina, and 15 years before that I was a lawyer. And the first thing we would always do would be to establish the facts, and then we would draw upon the facts and reach our conclusions. Fact number one, Democrats, in my opinion, and I know most of them, if not all of them, support the right of Israel to exist free from the threat of annihilation by Iran or any other state. That's a fact. Fact number two, I support the right of Israel to exist free from the threat of annihilation by any country. The state of Israel has the absolute right to feel threatened by Iran's conduct of assembling a nuclear arsenal. I support President Obama's responsible efforts to negotiate an agreement with Iran, short of imposing additional sanctions. The president is a strong negotiator. That is my opinion. He is a very strong negotiator. Secretary Kerry is a strong negotiator. Ambassador Rice is a strong negotiator. And we need not inhibit their ability to attempt a resolution protecting the state of Israel and the world. It is the protocol and custom of international diplomacy that heads of state have standing to invite other heads of state to their respective countries for diplomatic visits or speeches to the Parliamentary Assembly. In this case, the Speaker of the House extended an invitation to the Prime Minister with full knowledge that the invitation would be viewed as an insult and rebuke to the President and Vice President and Secretary of State. The Speaker, in my opinion, based on my knowledge, did not consult with the executive branch. I think that is acknowledged now. That is a matter of record. And the Speaker did not consult with the executive branch, which is unprecedented, and I believe it was intentional. I have received numerous calls from strong allies around the country commending me for my personal decision to not attend the joint session. A few just left my office just a moment ago. They understand, as I hope you understand, that I have the ability. I'm an intelligent 67-year-old man. I have the ability to separate my support for Israel from my disdain of the protocol used by the Speaker for the joint session. I received a very delightful call a few days ago from the Ambassador Ron Dermer, reassuring me that the Prime Minister continues to want and need the support of the Congressional Black Caucus. During that telephone conversation, I pleaded with the ambassador to seek a postponement of the joint session, but he dismissed that idea. Notwithstanding, I pledged to Israel my continued personal support and explained that Israel has many friends in the Congressional Black Caucus and do not think that Speaker Boehner's conduct will interfere with our relationship. Based on all of these facts, my personal decision was to watch the joint session on television, and I watched every word of it, and not attend, because I believe it was a politically motivated invitation. The speech made a convincing case for continued U.S. support and made clear that which we already knew, that the conduct of Iran is threatening and it is unacceptable. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth.
Next is Jim McDermott of Washington.
Thank you, and good morning. I concur in the remarks of most of my colleagues, but I want to take a somewhat different point to talk about so as not to repeat. The President of the United States' responsibility is to protect the people of the United States. That's his first and foremost responsibility. And in so doing, he has to deal with all kinds of things. When he came into office, we were at war in Afghanistan, we were at war in Iraq, and he has gradually tried to bring those situations down to a situation where we can withdraw and let the forces in those countries begin their evolution of whatever kind of government they want. In the case of Iran, we have had the president leading a negotiated effort consistently pushing forward in spite of a constant barrage of efforts to undermine even before it got off the ground. And here we are again today seeing that same thing. What you were witnessing today was a very old concept. If you can make the people afraid, you can make them do anything. And that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu was doing. He was trying to make people afraid and somehow saying that the president wasn't doing his job. There is no evidence whatsoever that the president does not have our safety first and foremost in his negotiation and his thinking about the future. In that sense, this was a very sad display of political activity being brought into the House of Representatives to demean what the president has been doing under great stress for the last years, 6-8 months directly, but even before that. How do you get things on a safe position with Iran? The president deserves our support and didn't need this today. John Boehner ought to be ashamed of himself for having brought it on him.
Lloyd Doggett of Texas.
Thank you, John. Well, surely the Prime Minister's strong speech satisfied his political objectives to attempt to survive in a very desperate election here in the next couple of weeks. I certainly do agree with him that we all stand with Israel. It is no more anti-Israel to criticize and challenge Mr. Netanyahu than it is anti-American to criticize and challenge Dick Cheney. If you look at what happened today, it is the first time in American history that as many as 60 members of the Congress deliberately chose not to participate in this campaign pep rally. And far more than that are questioning the approach that the Prime Minister is insisting upon. What do we know today that we did not know before he gave this speech? I think there's really only one thing. He is a rejectionist. There is no agreement that this administration could achieve with Iran that would be good enough for him. He wants to resolve all of the many wrong things that all of us have opposed with that Iran has been a part of and is a part of today in one agreement that should be focusing only on nuclear issues. I believe the Prime Minister thinks that inspectors, no matter how intrusive and how careful they are, may not be able to locate all of the nuclear facilities that Iran has underway. Well, if the inspectors can't locate them, how can he bomb all of them? Because the only alternative that he offers really in declining, in saying that war is not the option, is complete and total surrender by Iran. That is not going to happen. I believe that we need to continue to pursue verifiable, firm, intrusive inspections, and that we cannot give Mr. Netanyahu a veto power over what will protect both American and Israeli families. The Prime Minister was wrong about Iraq. He was wrong in the United Nations about an Iranian breakout. He was wrong about the interim agreement that has made our families safer, and he is wrong today. I do not trust war as the best way to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. The only approach that will work for the safety of our families is a verifiable agreement that this administration has worked so hard to achieve. The Iranians may prevent it, but we need to make every effort to achieve it. Thank you.
Earl Blumenauer of Oregon.
Thank you. Thank you. I was 6 weeks ago made it clear that I was not going to dignify what I think is a political charade and be part of Netanyahu's next campaign commercial, like his last appearance was. Nothing that I heard as I watched the speech on television suggests that the majority of the Israeli people who thought it was a mistake for him to come, or the majority of Americans who think it is a mistake to go through this exercise, I saw nothing to suggest that they were wrong. And I think as our friends in the news media do the deeper dive, as suggested by Jan, by Lloyd, I've listened to Netanyahu. I've been in Congress 19 years, back to when he first came. I've listened to his alarmist predictions. I listened to him cheerlead for the United States' greatest single blunder in our history, the Iraq War, that cost trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives, and the extent to which he's accurate that somehow Iran controls now 4 countries. And I think there's some question about that. But the extent to which they have outsized influence, it's a direct result to that disaster and his flawed judgment. He suggests that there is no alternative. Listen carefully to that speech and go back and listen to it. He gave no alternative path forward, just having a series of demands. Nothing that suggests that it would have any greater success. I think people ought to challenge his assumption that Iranians and Americans will always be enemies. Now think about that. All of my friends who visited Iran as private citizens are struck by how friendly and outgoing Iranians are. All of us represent people from Iran who are here in the United States and who are not necessarily friends of the regime. But they reject that category, that there can't be warmer relations between our countries. Surveys tell us that Iran is the only country in the Middle East where the majority of people, average normal people, still have positive feelings toward the United States. And we have a rich history of cooperation with the Iranian people dating back well over a century. But I was struck that the Prime Minister took all this time to come all this way, all the pomp and circumstance. I listened very carefully. There was not one word from the Prime Minister about how he would deal with his failure to move his country forward with a peace process with the Palestinians. Some of us were in Israel recently. The majority of Israelis favor a negotiated settlement and moving things forward. Prime Minister Netanyahu repeatedly has failed in that objective and had not one word about what he would do any differently. He's lecturing us about how we ought to conduct ourselves in the future when we have unparalleled progress with the potential of negotiations with 5 major countries aligned with us. And who thinks they're going to continue to be with us if we take his hard line and try and go it alone? I'd respectfully suggest this was a mistake. I'd respectfully suggest that Congress ought to take a deep breath, exhale, and allow the administration to see if they can bring this agreement across the finish line. Then they can always go forward with more extreme sanctions or war if they wish. Nothing is lost by attempting to make diplomacy work.
Steve Cohen of Tennessee.
Thank you. I chose early not to be in favor of the speech and asked that it be put off because I thought it would be political theater. And indeed it was political theater, worthy of an Oscar. This Republican leadership team has used the gallery in the House to advance political agendas and to give little favors to folks who come to Washington. Early, I think it was in January, they had a pro-life crowd come up here on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And so they scheduled a 20-week fetal pain bill to give them something they could vote on and say, look how good we are and how much we love you, and be strong with the pro-life crowd. Today they did the same thing with AIPAC. Speaker Boehner was successful, I think, in cementing his and the Republicans' relationship with AIPAC and with some very wealthy donors who I think were behind this entire program, this entire speech, who are active in the Republican Party and oppose the president and Democrats. And I believe the Prime Minister was successful in probably getting reelected. I'm sure this will play well in Israel. Now, as far as how it affects the world in reality, I think it's harmful because the game is in Geneva, not in Washington and on television. And it would have been better if he took his concerns directly to the President and the State Department behind the scenes and tried to get a better deal. Instead, he's driven himself and his country further away from the President and our country. And I agree with the 200 Israeli generals and security officials who felt that this will hurt Israel because it will make Israel weaker in the eyes of the United States administration and its relationship with the President, and embolden Iran to be even tougher at the bargaining table, and make more likely that there'll be an agreement that is less beneficial to Israel. So I think the political game was won, but the world game of peace was lost today. I had misgivings at times listening to the speech as a Jewish American. Whenever the Holocaust is brought up, threats to the Jewish people, I'm concerned. But I definitely feel that everybody is trying to do the same thing and to be on Israel's side and support Israel. And the President has Israel's best interest at heart as well. And negotiations are the only way you can do it. There was not an alternative except for more sanctions. Everybody pretty much agreed. I watched the speech on television with a bunch of AIPAC folks from Memphis. And we all agreed that this regime is rather bizarre in some of its ambitions, most of its ambitions, and its hate for Israel and America. But with that as a given, I don't think that additional sanctions and lack of an agreement would drive them to their knees. I think it would just embolden them and make the world less safe.
Peter Welch of Vermont.
Thank you. Pardon me. Thank you very much. I attended the speech. I have a strong relationship and support of Israel, strong opposition to the conduct of Iran. Voted 10 times for new sanctions and to enhance existing sanctions. Voted 5 times to condemn the government of Iran for its human rights violations. I've signed letters, done basically everything I can to support strong Israel and to challenge belligerent Iran. But I also went to the speech because I was hoping that I would hear from the Prime Minister something that would justify why he came in the first place to give this speech 2 weeks before his election, and why he arranged this speech totally behind the back of the White House with Speaker Boehner, and why he wanted to make a decision that put at risk what has always been a strong bipartisan approach towards Israel and turned it into a partisan battlefield. Frankly, I came away from the speech disappointed. You know, a nuclear Iran is off the table. The president has made that clear. In his position, distrust but verify. His position, no deal is better than a bad deal. What I heard from the Prime Minister today was that no deal is better than any deal. I did not hear from the Prime Minister Plan B. What will happen as an alternative if we have no negotiations? Does that mean a military strike, and who's involved? Does it mean we follow the advice with respect to Iran that he gave us with respect to Iraq? The biggest long-term mistake that I think the Prime Minister made was in embracing a Boehner-led effort while he snubbed very directly the President of the United States. A strong U.S.-Israel relationship has the support of Congress. It needs the continued support of the administration. And why would a friend of America act this way towards the President, whose record itself is one of enormous support for Israel? Under President Obama, Israel, and with our support, by the way, Israel has received over $20 billion since 2009. And under President Obama, the U.S. has provided Israel with over $1.3 billion for the Iron Dome system alone, totaling, that was after Gaza, totaling $2.9 billion under President Obama. And last year, it was the United States that was standing by Israel with respect to 18 resolutions in the UN. Prime Minister Netanyahu directly challenged the president, who has directly and steadfastly been the friend of Israel. And he did not offer an alternative to negotiations, but repudiated those negotiations before we even know what the final deal may be. So this, I think, did not help. And it's unfortunate that the Prime Minister chose to make this speech at this time. Thank you.
And last but tallest, Jared Huffman of California.
Thank you, John. I'm Jared Huffman from California. I attended this speech, but I might well have joined some of my colleagues in not attending it, but for the fact that almost every day around here there's something outrageous going on that floor upstairs, and I'd get myself into a truancy problem pretty quick if I started not attending every time I had frustrations and concerns. Look, I am pro-Israel by any measure. I've consistently voted to support Israel, to support the U.S.-Israel relationship. I have traveled to Israel. I have family in Israel. My eyes are wide open about Iran and the current regime in Iran. I don't want them to have nuclear weapons. I understand the threat that they pose not just to Israel, but to broader security concerns that we care about. But I feel like we have to give the diplomatic problem-solving track a chance, at least, to succeed. And I think the danger in what happened today is we had Prime Minister Netanyahu telling us, stop trying. Don't even pursue a diplomatic track with this government. He did a great job of smacking down a straw man deal that doesn't exist, certainly not in the form that he characterized, and may never exist. But I think there's a real danger when we say we're just not going to pursue diplomatic solutions anymore. And I just want to add one more thing. To hear it from a foreign leader who's got a real judgment problem, a real credibility problem on these issues, makes it that much more troubling, whether it's the joint plan of action, mischaracterizations, whether it was last year when he wanted us to go to war in Syria over chemical weapons, whether it was the original Iraq war. We've got a real credibility and a judgment problem. And to hear the Prime Minister tell us that the enemy of our enemy is our enemy, and that we must always be enemies of Iran, is just a little too much for me to stomach. So this was a step backward, unfortunately, in our relations, I believe, with Israel. It doesn't shake my support for Israel, but it does give me one more reason to be concerned about the current government of Israel, and to hope that in the future, whether it's Prime Minister Netanyahu or another Prime Minister, we'll have an Israeli Prime Minister that not only says he respects our president, but treats our president with respect.
Thanks to everyone. Just questions for everybody. Yeah.
Those of you who did not attend the speech, what did you achieve by not attending the speech? The House was still full. He got a standing ovation. What did you all achieve by not being there?
I wasn't part of the charade.
Yeah.
I wasn't part of it either, and I was able to share it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't surety for what I thought was political theater and a wrong use of the congressional chamber, and I got to share it with at least a dozen or more AIPAC members from Memphis and have an interchange.
Also, I would say that the House of Representatives is the most prestigious venue in the world, and to use it for political purposes was something that I did not want to be part of.
And let me just underscore, this isn't a matter of agreeing or disagreeing with the Speaker. You know, we've all been to speeches by foreign leaders in the chamber which we partly agreed with and partly disagreed with, including Prime Minister Netanyahu's prior speeches. This is a matter of abstaining from a speech that should never have occurred. That's what's different about it.
Make no mistake, occasionally the House of Representatives is involved in political theatrics. This was unusual in terms of how it was undercutting our own government.
Could I just say that? I had an executive session with myself. That's what I did. And I listened to every word of the speech with 25 members of AIPAC from Atlanta, and then talk with them. I think I did the right thing.
Can I ask you all about a specific line in the speech? When the Prime Minister said that if Israel has to stand alone, Israel will stand. Can I get your takes of a few people on that?
He made the same argument over the Iraq War, that it was time for the United States to not pay attention to any world opinion, but just to go it alone. What I heard today felt to me like an effort to stampede the United States into war once again. That we should break from the P5, if not P4, P5 plus 1, yeah, we're the one. That we should break with them, and I believe that it was to consider war.
Let me just say that he apparently tried that once before. And in one of the only foreign policy decisions of the Bush administration that I agree with, the Bush administration said no in 2008, according to reports. We need to be clear that that's not an acceptable approach. And I guess the Israeli people will decide in this election if they think it's an acceptable approach.
I think that's delusional. I mean, they have nuclear weapons. Netanyahu presumably could unleash dozens of nuclear weapons. Israelis know they can't go it alone. That's why all of us have voted repeatedly for money and assistance, sometimes when they do things that give us heartburn, like a reckless settlement policy. But the notion somehow that he thinks that Israel can just bowl through this on their own against the world, I think, based on my limited experience in Israel, and Israelis don't believe that. And that's why I think a majority of Israelis think their country is on the wrong path, regardless of how their odd math works out in their final election.
What's the burden on the part of the White House now in responding to this? I know obviously you have your disagreements with what he said, but there's a powerful stage that he had today that's going to reach a lot of people. What is the White House going to do, both publicly and with House Democrats, Senate Democrats, to try to maintain support?
I think that's really the White House's decision. I mean, I think all of us are here today because this was in our body, in our house, and none of us supported that activity. But I do think that what you'll see in the coming days is a White House that is committed to pursuing these negotiations. And I don't think they're going to my guess is they will not let this speech distract them from that. That's the most important thing that they have going right now. And I think they will just move on and let their actions be the response.
Well, let me just say, though, I think at the very least the intention or the hope of the Prime Minister was to then force the administration to make its case in favor of diplomacy, to raise the kinds of questions now that the White House is going to have to devote itself to trying to explain or tamp down. I thought that Susan Rice did a magnificent job at her AIPAC speech yesterday, laying out what those real choices are. It's very compelling. It was not made on the floor of the House of Representatives, which with every media outlet right there. But I think that right now with the Secretary of State in Geneva, that the White House will, have to respond now in some way that wouldn't have happened had the Prime Minister not made the speech.
I just want to add to that, if I could. I think the White House needs to keep its eye on the ball. This diplomatic effort was going to be tough anyway. I think the White House has told us it's an uphill fight to whether they can even get to yes with Iran. So to allow this to be a distraction, to set them back further from what's already a tough mission, I think would be unfortunate, but I think they will move forward. I think they understand that this is a prime minister who's never seen a war that he didn't want our country to fight, and that they need to finish a tough job. It may not lead to a deal, but if there's any possibility that it can, we need to stay focused and give it a shot.
bringing up Holocaust and genocide to make his case today for Congress. What did you think, and this is also a question for any other Jewish members of Congress, what did you think about that decision to use that tragedy to make his point?
I think it's an overreach by far, and I think he knew that. I was thinking about, and maybe it's a given, everybody sees it, but in political theater, what you had today, especially with Joe Biden not sitting behind him, was everything that the State of the Union is. Packed house, all the congressmen, representatives, give or take, and he took the place of the president and spoke from where the president speaks in the State of the Union, it was putting him on an equal level with the President of the United States in Washington, D.C. and the Congress. And that was wrong, and that's why I didn't attend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
John, great. I think it was very much.
Those House Democrats we just saw held their news conference about an hour after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint meeting of Congress.